The history of the Hurrians. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. So in the past, we talked a lot about the Hurrians, but let's actually learn about them. So, who are the Hurrians? The Hurrians were a people of the Bronze Age Near East. They spoke a Hurru-Uratrian language called Hurrian and lived in Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. The Hurrians descended from the mountains south of the Caspian Sea, occupied the land between the Hittites and Assyria, east of the Tigris River, and in the Zagros mountain range. From there, they spread into the areas of northern Mesopotamia and Syria as well, even to the Mediterranean coast. So here's just a map of the Hurrians. It is in yellow, their concentration. So this is from BibleGateway.com, and it reads, Origin and geographic distribution. Groups either designating themselves as Hurrians, cuneiform Hurri, or writing a language identified elsewhere with the Hurri, have been identified all over the ancient Near East, from ancient Nuzi, east of the Tigris River, to Hutasa or Hatasa in Central Asia Minor, to Palestine, and even lower, i.e., northern Egypt. In Akkadian sources, whether from Nuzi, Mari, Hutasa, Alachane, Ugaritic, or Egypt al-Armana, the people and their language were termed Hurri. The Egyptians called the land of Palestine Hurri, but spelled it in cognates Hor. In the Mitanni letter found at Almarna, the native Hurrian term was Hurru or Hurro. In the Old Testament, the corresponding term is, which is in Hebrew, from earlier Hurri. The language of the Hurrians, which is still only practically partially understood, seems related to only one other known language, Uratrian. In which the kings of Urartu around Lake Van composed inscriptions during the first half of the first millennium BC, circa 900 through 600 BC. It is believed by some that both Hurrian and Uratrian belong to languages of the Caucasus, ancient Armenia. History. Hurrians appeared in the Near East as early as the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, which was 2300. Hurrians occupied the great half-circle of the Tartarus Mountains from Ukarish north of Karkash to the country of Namur around Lake Van, and perhaps as far south as the upper Zeb River. It is from circa 1400 BC that the great influx of Hurrian deities and Hurrian mythology in the Hittite corpus is dated. The greatest political achievement of the Hurrians was the kingdom of Mitanni, whose capital was Washhuana in the middle Euphrates Valley. At its height, circa 1400 BC, Mitanni dominated Kezuwata and North Syria on the west, Assyria in the central region, and Nuzi in the east. During this period, from 15 through 1400 BC, Mitanni was ruled by kings who bore Indo-Aryan, i.e., non-Hurrian names, such as Shutarna, Harshatarna, Shushkarshnatar, and Artama, and Tush-Arata. They carried on royal correspondence and international trade with the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty of Egypt as equals. So here is a map of the general area where the Hurrians would have been. And then, of course, you have surrounding peoples like the Hittites and Luvians and the Armenians, who are kind of connected with Hurrians. And you have the Semites more towards the south, northwest Semites over here, and the Akkadians and Arabians. So this is where the Hurrians would have been, basically in the very center of the general Middle East, but to the north of Mesopotamia. So this is from Britannia, and it says, the Hurrians entered the orbit of ancient Middle Eastern civilization toward the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. According to the Soviet scholars Igor M. Dengov and Sergei A. Starshnim, the Eastern Caucasian languages are an offshoot of the Hurrian Uratrian group. Hurrian, one of a people important in the history and culture of the Middle East during the 2nd millennium BC, the earliest recorded presence of Hurrian personal and place names is in Mesopotamian records of the late 3rd millennium. These point to the area east of the Tigris River and the mountain range of Zagros as the Hurrian habitat. From then on, and especially during the early 2nd millennium, there is scattered evidence of a westward spread of Hurrians, and even greater westward migration, probably set in motion by the intrusion of Indo-Iranians from the north, seems to have taken place after 1700 BC, apparently issuing from the area between Lake Van and the Zagros. Evidence indicates that the Hurrians overthrew the Assyrian rulers and subsequently dominated the area. Hurrians likewise occupied large sections of eastern Anatolia, thereby becoming eastern neighbors and later partial dependents of the Hittites. And one of the most interesting sections from that part was the fact that the Hurrians overthrew the Assyrian rulers, which, of course, Assyrians being Semitic, so it's very, very interesting. These non-Semitic people overthrowing a Semitic dynasty. It's very interesting. Now it says, yet the Hurrian heartland during this period was northern Mesopotamia, and the country then known as Hurri, where the political units were dominated by dynasties of Indo-Iranian origin. In the 15th century BC, the Hurrian area, ranging from the Iranian mountains to Syria, was united into a state called Mitanni. Despite political subjugation, the continued Hurrian ethnic and cultural presence in Syria and the Sicilian region, which was called Kiswadina, strongly influenced the Hittites. The carvings at Yez Ali Kaya for instance, suggests that the official pantheon of the Hittite Empire was thoroughly, thoroughly Hurrianized. Hittite queens had Hurrian names, and Hurrian mythology appeared in Hittite epic poems. So the Hittites were greatly influenced by the Hurrians, and the Hurrians seem to have put their fingers into a lot of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. It's very interesting to see that they had such influence on these people groups. So continuing, it reads, it is not known whether the migrations of the Hurrians ever took the form of aggressive invasion. 18th century 18th century BC text from Mari speaks of battles with the Hurrian tribes of Tertuku south of Lake Aruma, some 150 miles from the Caspian Sea's southwest corner. But these were mountain campaigns, not the warding off of an offensive. In the 15th century, al-Laqi was heavily Hurrianized, and in the empire of Mitanni, the Hurrians represented the leading and perhaps the most numerous population group. And excuse me for any mispronunciations of some of these words. But it's very interesting how the Hurrians began to become quite numerous in these areas of the ancient Near East, becoming large in number. So the Hurrian and Mitanni kingdoms. The weakening of the Semitic states in Mesopotamia after 1550 BC enabled the Hurrians to penetrate deeper into this region, where they founded numerous small states in the eastern part of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. After 1500 BC, isolated dynasties appeared with Indo-Aryan names, but the significance of this is disputed. So it's very interesting how many of these Semitic states began to weaken, which gave rise to the Hurrians that began to make small city-states. I think this is very important for us to understand when it comes to the ancient Near East, and with us knowing that the Hurrians are a non-Semitic people, and that they are beginning to really set up shop within the ancient land of the Middle East. This is very important to know when studying these ancient populations and peoples and civilizations. So here is where the Hurrians would have been. Again, a people of the northeastern Caucasian stock, and they were set up pretty much in northern Mesopotamia and in parts of Syria and Anatolia and Iran. And as you can see right here, this is the Mitanni Empire that I was talking about. And here are the Hurrians, and here's Urartu. So this is just one map showing the typical area where these non-Semitic people and civilizations were. So this is from World History Encyclopedia, and it reads, detailing the Hurrians. The Hurrians, aka Hurri or Khuri, were a Bronze Age people who flourished across the Near East from the 4th millennium BCE to the 1st millennium BCE. Hurrians formed the principal cultural elements of the Bronze Age Mitanni Kingdom and blended with the culture of the neighboring and then conquering Hittites. By the late Bronze Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated into surrounding cultures in the Near East, but many of their gods and mythologies will live on in later cultures, notably the Urartu civilization, and even inspired elements of mythology found in archaic Greece. That part's fairly interesting, especially if the Hurrians carried haplogroup J, and we know that J markers came into ancient Greece, so that part is fairly interesting. Continuing, it says, probably Hurri was originally the designation bore by the population group, which was then applied to the land they inhabited and the language they spoke. Hurrian has only one other related ancient language, Urartian, and their connection to any living languages is uncertain. Typologically, Hurrian is an agglutinating language with ergative grammar, unlike Indo-European and Semitic, but like the Sumerian language. So basically, the structure of Hurrian is it's not Indo-European and it's not Semitic, basically, but it's similar to Sumerian, which we covered in the past. Hurrian speakers inhabited a core area that is the upper Habur and Tigris rivers up to the Tartarus and Zagros mountains, especially around Lake Van. Textual evidence of the Hurrians dates to the mid-3rd millennium BCE, but based on archaeological evidence, it is likely the culture at least stretched back to the mid-4th millennium BCE, generally known in ancient sources as the Hurri. The culture and language may also be referred to as a substratu or substrations. While in biblical text they are the Horites, strictly speaking, the descendants of the Hurrians and Canaan. Very interesting. We'll touch more on that later. One of the earliest and most important Hurrian sites was Ugarish, and it is from here that the earliest known inscriptions of the language were discovered. Other Mesopotamian city-states with evidence of the worship of Hurrian gods and personal names include Karib and Nagar, starting from the 4th millennium BCE. Then the Hurrians thrived and expanded across Upper Mesopotamia. It is likely that the Hurrian conquest of the region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration, infiltration by mercenary bands and the pay of local city-states, followed by the rise of a power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Hurrian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys. Further, the Hurrians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city-states they conquered, making them less visible than ever in recorded history. For example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Hurrian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Hurrians. And that's very interesting. This does seem to be the traits of the Hurrians and other Hurrian-related tribes and people that there was a lot of them, and they came into the Middle East through various different ways, like warfare or peaceful, but they typically adopted and assimilated into the cultures, and typically that would be Semitic or Indo-European cultures of the Near East. So that's very interesting and something to keep in mind about these ancient people. So continuing, it says, when the kingdom of Akkad fell in 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. There was no Hurrian empire as such, but some of the independent city-states ruled by Hurrian kings may well have formed together in a loose confederation. Still, others were in conflict with each other. By the second quarter of the 2nd millennium BCE, the Hurrians were migrating into northern Syria and eastern Anatolia as they moved westward and southward. Once again, military conquest was mixed with the peaceful migration of Hurrian merchants, farmers, artisans, and nomads. The Mitanni Kingdom, 1500 through 1240 BCE, which was predominantly Hurrian in culture. And so that's, again, it's interesting how it's emphasized that after Akkad, which was a Semitic Mesopotamian civilization, fell, this is when these Hurrians began to come into Mesopotamia and basically sweep through the land. It seems to be that most of the time when the Semitic empires fell, that's when the Hurrians came in. And again, it's either through military or it's through peaceful migration that these Hurrians typically migrated. So it's very important to keep in mind. So here is a map of the Mitanni that I mentioned quite often. and the Mitanni was, as they said, heavily populated by Hurrian peoples, and the Mitanni Empire was quite large. It took most of northern Mesopotamia and even parts of more central Mesopotamia, and this would have been where a lot of Hurrians were concentrated. So this is from archaeology archive, and the title is "Who Were the Hurrians?" and the publication a publication of the Archaeological Institute of America. So it reads, but Iper Michael Oski, an Assyrianologist at the University of Michigan, notes that Hurrian, like Sumerian, is a language unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European tongues that dominated the region during and after the 3rd millennium BC. Perhaps, he suggests, the Hurrians were either inhabitants of the region who, like the Sumerians, had to make room for the Semitic-speaking peoples who created the world's first empire based at Akkad in central Mesopotamia around 2350 BC. Far, far from being yet another rough nomadic tribe, such as the Amorites or Kassites, who were latecomers to the Mesopotamian party. The Hurrians and their unique language, music, deities, and rituals may have played a key role in shaping the first cities, empires, and states. Now that's very powerful. The language has died. The music faded, and the rituals are forgotten. But thanks to the sculptors, stonemasons, and seal carvers at Ugrish, Hurrian creativity can shine once again. And so that's one thing you're going to hear a lot about the Hurrians when these archaeologists talk about them, that they were a great influence in the ancient Near East. And that makes sense because these people are so heavily populated in that time. They were numerous, as most of these archaeologists say and historians say. So it makes sense that they will be a great influence on the ancient Near East. This is again why the Hurrians are very important people to study if you want to know about the ancient Near East. So here is the Mitanni Empire again, just showing you visually where the Hurrians would have been concentrated, because remember, the Hurrians were one of the most numerous people in Mitanni. They basically created Mitanni, even though it was ruled by Iranian peoples. But this is a wide range, and it's very interesting how they managed to do this. It was after the fall of Akkad, after the fall of Semitic dynasties. So this is the narrative literature of Hurrian origin, moving treasures from the ancient Near East, and it reads, the Hurrians were one of the most important civilizations of the ancient Near East, but we have far less linguistic, historical, and archaeological information about them than the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, or Hittites. The Hurrian epic poems are also a fascinating but lesser known aspect of ancient Near Eastern literary traditions. But the Hurrians played another critical role creating and transmitting Mesopotamian traditions across the ancient world, even as far as Greece, which we read about earlier. Over 1,000 years of history, circa 2500 through 1300 BCE, Hurrian civilization occupied a vast area from the lower Zeb east of the Tigris to southeast Anatolia, embracing all of northern Mesopotamia and Syria. This helps us to understand how Hurrian culture embodied the convergence of different cultural traditions. The modern name of the people, Hurrians, and their language is based on the ancient geographical term Hurri, attested in cuneiform sources of the 2nd millennium BCE, and presumably denoted most of Upper Mesopotamia. The Hurrian language was neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and had only one relative, Uratrian, attested in the 1st millennium BCE. The oldest historical and archaeological evidence for Hurrian civilization dates to the latter 3rd millennium BCE, and small kingdoms across northern Mesopotamia were governed by rulers with Hurrian names. One of these, the ancient city of Ugrish, was recently excavated at Mozan in the Kehreb Valley of northeast Syria. A foundation inscription of Tish Atal, a ruler of Ugrish, who bore the Hurrian regal title Indin, is the oldest document of the Hurrian language. A distinctive feature of the Hurrian culture and civilization is the coexistence of Sumero-Akkadian influences and original Hurrian elements. In effort, in effect, Hurrians were intermediaries passing Mesopotamian traditions to the western areas of the ancient Near East. During the first half of the second millennium BCE, solid Hurrian element in the population of Syria between the Mediterranean and the Euphrates is attested by the many Hurrian personal names in texts, and is likely a result of movements at the end of the previous millennium. During their movements towards more western regions of Syria and southeast Anatolia, Hurrians encountered Northwest Semitic cultural and religious traditions, which henceforth played a fundamental role in Hurrian culture. So that's interesting. A lot of Hurrians began to move into Syria, a region that we typically associate with Semites, but these non-Semitic populations came in, and it was heavily Semitic, but you begin to see sort of like a fusion, which is interesting. The largest and most important Hurrian state, the Mitanni Kingdom, flourished during the second half of the second millennium BCE and occupied a wide area between Nuzi in eastern Iraq and Kizuwata in southeastern Anatolia. Mitanni was one of the great kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age, and for a century fought with Egypt for supremacy over Syria. In the first half of the 14th century, stability was reached between the great kings of Mitanni and the Egyptian pharaohs. Dynastic marriages between princesses of Mitanni and Egyptian pharaohs resulted, attested in the corpus diplomatic correspondence between the two courts, discovered in the Egyptian archives at the capital of El Ormana. And that's very interesting. We see mixing with the royal dynasties of Egypt with these Mitanni people. And of course, we know, as we've read, the Mitanni, their population was Hurrian, a Northeast Caucasian people, but the ruling class was Indo-Aryan or Indo-Iranian people. So perhaps this could be a way or explain some of uh, the more European genetic components into Egypt, the more Iranian type of components into Egypt, as well as the Caucasian. It's very interesting. But Mitanni's state could not resist the military expansions of the Hittite Empire under King Sebu Ulamina I, who conquered most of Mitanni's Syrian territory and decreed the end of this great kingdom in 1340 BCE. So here's just a map detailing the Hurrians and related Hurrian peoples. So you got the Mitanni Empire right here, and the Hurrians and the Urartu, and this sort of what we're dealing with. Here's another map detailing it, the Mitanni and the Hurrians right here, and the Urartu. So this kind of gives you a visualization of everything that's going on. So this is a book also explaining the Hurrians. It's called The Indo-European Elements in Hurrian, and it says, The Hurrian language is attested from the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE until around the middle of the 13th century BCE. Hurrian was the language of the once powerful Mitanni Kingdom. And here's a map just showing it. After the Assyrian conquest of the areas peopled by Hurrians in northern Mesopotamia, many of them seem to have been deported by Tukulti Nimruta I, which was around 1244 through 1208 BCE, who named manpower to build his new capital, who needed manpower to build his new capital. And that's very interesting. That seems to be something Assyrians did quite often. They would remove people from their homelands and then bring them to their land to do work, and sometimes even import new people into the land. That's actually what happened with the Israelites as well. They were taken out and other people were placed in, and this happened with the Hurrians. But anyways, it reads, these events probably caused major disruption in the survival of the Hurrian language. According to McQueen and Gregg, Hurrian became extinct not long after the fall of that kingdom in the 13th century BCE, probably around 1000 BCE. And that's fairly interesting because obviously there are such a numerous people, but their language became extinct. But although the language is gone, keep in mind that doesn't mean the people is gone. And as we read earlier about the Hurrians, they often adopted and assimilated into people, so they could have assimilated into these surrounding peoples like all the Semitic nations that they were around. So keep in mind, although the language might be gone, the people doesn't have to be gone. So something to remember. So this book also details the Hurrians, and it's called Facts, Fiction, and the Bible: the truth behind the stories in the Old Testament. And it reads, the Hurrians came from Armenia, but their ruling class were Aryans, who originated from central Russia, from the region east and north of the Caspian and Aral Seas. They founded the Hurrian Empire, also known as the Kingdom of Mitanni, named after an Aryan clan. They introduced the composite bow, which was a formidable long-range weapon, which was a long-range infantry weapon, and they had developed a lightweight, spoked, two-wheeled version of the chariot. Because of their military superiority, they were able to extend their influence throughout Syria and Palestine, preferring to live in the cities where they became the local ruling class. Interesting. So here are the Hurrians, by the way, just another map so I can really like drill in to y'all the location of the Hurrians. I think that's very important to know where they were, and to just show that that the Middle East had a lot of different peoples there in the ancient times, not just all Semites. So here's another good book dealing with the Hurrians. This is the Armenian Journal of Near Eastern Societies, and it reads, the Hurrian language is one of the extinct languages which were once spoken in the area around Mesopotamia and the Caucasus in the last 4th millenniums BCE. Its first attestations date back to the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE, circa 2300. At the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, Hurrian is attested in southeastern Anatolia and in the Zagros-Tartous range of northern Mesopotamia. In the middle of the 2nd millennium, Hurrian influence is also attested in Syria and in Sicily or Kizawada region. Hurrian was the main language of the Mitanni Kingdom, as it attested by the so-called Mitanni letter, written by Tarushnat, king of Mitanni, to Menotep III. The proto-history of the Hurrian language and people is shrouded with some uncertainty, but there are good indications that the presence of Hurrian people in Upper Mesopotamia is fairly ancient. To start with, Hurrian is closely related to the Uratrian language, which was spoken in eastern Anatolia, a little to the north and east of Hurrian between about 850 and 600 BCE. Uratrian is not a descendant of Hurrian, rather, they are sister languages, both going back to a common Hurro-Uratrian parent language, probably located to the northeast of Mesopotamia in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains and dated to before the 3rd millennium BCE. Dankoff, who can be credited for establishing the relationship between the two languages, concludes that Uratrian is not a late dialect of Hurrian, but a separate language derived from one. So here is the kingdom of the Hurrians, or the Hurrian kingdom. Here's Ugarish, Hurrians. So this is just another map, just detailing where they're at. Have your Semites to the south. They are distinguished because there's Semite nomads and Akkad, Semite nomads and Bedouins. And then you got the Hurrians up here. So here is a book also talking about the Hurrians, The History of Ancient Palestine. And it reads, among the invaders of Syria during the 2nd millennium BCE were the Hurrians, a non-Semitic people which, as time went by, created one of the most powerful states in the Near East, namely the Mitanni Kingdom. The spread of the Hurrian, I just want to detail that right there. These Hurrians, a non-Semitic people, they had a powerful empire in Syria in the ancient Near East. And I think that is just extremely fascinating. And that's something that I have not known about the ancient Near East in the past. But now that I'm getting more of this understanding of the ancient Near East, it's interesting to see that there was just various different peoples living there. Not everybody was Semitic. You had non-Semitic people in places that today have a lot of Semitic speakers. So it's interesting to see that. So continuing, it reads, the spread of the Hurrians as well as their influence is witnessed by texts from Nuzi, Baghazako, Alakhi, Mari, Rash Shrama, Tel Armarna, and the Ta'ak in Palestine, among other places. And forgive me for my mispronunciations. They are known from Anatolia from circa 2400 BCE and from about 2300 BCE. They were settled in the hill regions of Upper Mesopotamia, where they established a kingdom, Ugarish. The texts from Alakik at level 7 show that around 1700 BC, a third of the population of that city was Hurrian, and circa 100 years later, the Hurrians were the majority. Now that's fairly interesting. And by the way, that's a area in Syria that they're referring to, a city in Syria. The same is true for Ugarit in the 15th century. It was only when Ugarit was freed from Hurrian political dominance in the 14th century BCE that its literary golden age came about. I. M. Dankoff thinks that the original home of the Hurrians could have been in Transcaucasia. From a cultural point of view, the Hurrians can be considered as one of the most important peoples of the Near East. Like I said, most people are going to say this when it comes to the Hurrians, most scholars. That's why you have to know about these people. Anyways, already in the Akkad period, which was around 2300 BCE, they had acquired the art of writing using the cuneiform for their own language. Hurrian is an agglutinative language related to Uratrian, and North Caucasia. So again, just detailing again where these Hurrians are. Uh, here you see in italics the Hurrians in south of the Caucasus, north of Mesopotamia and Iran. And you have other non-Semitic speakers like the Hattians and Anatolia, Hurrians and Hattians and such. And these peoples will eventually come into Semitic lands. I have Kassites right here and Gutians right there. So here is the book The Chechenians that does a really good breakdown of the Hurrians as well as their descendants today and the language they spoke. And it reads, on the other hand, the North Caucasian perspective goes back to the most ancient of Caucasian cultures, dating back to more than the 5th millennium ago. For thousands of years, the Vanak lived in their North Caucasian domicile, which waxed and waned as invaders came and went, but was preserved more or less intact due to the nation's remarkable tendency. Linguistic evidence ties Vanak culture to the ancient Hurrian and Urartian civilizations that flourished at the Near East that flourished in the Near East a few millennia ago. The Vanak also constituted an important element in the Neolithic Core-Araxes culture in the Transcaucasus. Some authors believe that the Nak nation was an offspring of the Hurrians and Urartians, builders of magnificent civilizations in the ancient Near East that had profound influences upon other cultures of the region. It is certain that the Nak constituted an important component of the Hurrian Urartian tribes in the Transcaucasus and played a role in the development of their influential cultures. E. A. Spencer suggested that the Transcaucasus was the original Hurrian homeland. Some scholars also propose the existence of a linguistic and cultural Northeast Caucasian and Hurrian, later Urartian, spinal continuum. The most probable theory of Nak ancestry is that it was a reunion of the Caucasian Nak, the location of whose original domicile is still a moot point in some of the Urartian remnants of the breakup of the kingdom of Urartu, with the Transcaucasus being the most likely locality at which this fusion took place. It is thought that the Proto-Caucasian Nak and Proto-Hurrians had common ancestry. Thus, at least part of the genealogy of the Nak peoples can be attributed to the Hurrians and their descendants, the Urartians. From Hurrians to modern Vanak, there were many nation tribes that can be viewed as forming connecting links in the genealogical chain. Some Urartian tribes were incorporated into other peoples, but the Vanak and Tovotushans resisted assimilation and are considered as the only linguistic and ethnic remnants of the Hurrians and Urartians. Despite the obscurity of their origins, the Hurrians became one of the great and influential peoples of the Near East from the 3rd millennium BC to the 14th century BC. Their original homeland was probably South Caucasus down to the Armenian Plateau and the Zagros-Tartars Mountains. Later they extended to Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and northern Syria. The Hurrian language was neither Indo-European nor Semitic, but was akin to Northeast Caucasian languages, or Alduin languages, descendants of Urartian, including Chechenian and Luizguian. Hurrian language reached its akin in the period from the 16th to the 14th century BC. The generally accepted date for the downfall of Hurrian civilization is 1365 BC. The numerous clans of the Hurrians, such as the Gutis, Hattians, Kassites, established the Kassite kingdom in Babylonia in the 15th century BC. Kurti, Proto-Kurds, Mitannis, Mushki, and Eritreans formed empires and city-states that bore their names. The core Araxes culture is also attributed to the Hurrians. It is generally accepted that a number of small Hurrian states gradually united to form the Empire of Mitanni. The Hurrians were so ubiquitous that many Indo-Iranian and Indo-European peoples are believed to have substantive Hurrian contributions in their ethnogenesis. For example, the Kurds consider themselves and their culture as descendants of the Hurrians and their civilization, despite linguistic differentiation. There are also suggestions that the ancestors of the Armenians were a mixture of Hurrians and Indo-European Peruvians. However, linguistic evidence suggests that the Northeast Caucasians are the genuine descendants of the Hurrians. And so again, just detailing where these Hurrians are. In yellow is the map of the Hurrians. So genetically speaking, it's highly likely that Hurrians had haplogroup J, and phenotypically, Hurrians likely looked Armenoid because of geographically where they come from. So this is from How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads in yellow, specific part I'm going to read. The Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands and present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the core Araxes culture. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS282, and J1-Y5353 are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups. Suggests Northeast Caucasian languages who have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant, as well as support the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So here's the phenotype of the likely Hurrians as well. As we read, they would have likely had J markers, and then geographically, Hurrians lived in the common and mountainous regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia, which is where we find the Armenoid phenotype. And the description is short-headed and high skull type with fleshy features, a flat occiput, and hooked nose, often black-haired with light brown skin. So that's likely what a Hurrian would look like just based on geography. So the Hurrians, just putting everything together that we learned so far, the Hurrians likely descended from the core Araxes culture. The Hurrians were a Bronze Age people of the ancient Near East, but they were not Semites. They were a Caucasian people, and they spoke a Northeast Caucasian language. The Hurrians resided in Anatolia, Syria, Armenia, basically south of the Caucasus in northern Mesopotamia. Based on the Hurrians' background, they likely would have been carriers of haplogroup J and phenotypically looked Armenoid. And although they often assimilated and adopted the culture of surrounding peoples, they did have a powerful civilization called Mitanni, and they had great influence over other neighboring civilizations as well. But this is where we end with the Hurrians, the history of the Hurrians. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Leave a comment for any questions you might have. And follow my social media accounts that I mentioned at the beginning of the video so you can get more information. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.